A gruesome discovery was made in a dilapidated house in Blossom Alley, Portsea. Mary Frances Pelham, a 37-year-old woman who sold flowers and was a prostitute, was found dead in her bed by her neighbour. She had been strangled with a scarf and beaten with a broken bottle. Her face was covered in blood and terribly swollen, and her tongue was protruding. Who killed Mary Pelham and why? So begins the case of the singular coincidence. The gruesome murder of Mary Pelham took place on the 27th of January 1923 at 13A Blossom Alley, in the heart of Portsmouth slums. Sadly, this murder most dire is unsolved, and a perpetrator has never been brought to justice. Perhaps in the telling of this story you may find within the clues you are able to come to some conclusions of your own. Blossom Alley was notorious as the worst of the worst slums in Portsmouth after the Great War. In fact, the murder, brought to public view through newspaper articles and people visiting, the insanitary conditions the residents were expected to live in. It was soon after, due to public pressure, the residents were rehomed and the area flattened for new developments. Mary Pelham was 37 years old and lived in Blossom Alley, in a room in an almost derelict building. At her inquest, her trade was noted as a flower girl. They would get up early and buy flowers at the market and set up to sell to passers-by. The profits were really very tiny, and as many poor single women did in these times, Mary worked part-time as a prostitute to supplement her meagre income. You will see as you listen along, many of the women who were in Mary's position also worked part-time as prostitutes. It was of course dangerous, and many women were badly beaten, which was sadly accepted as just part of the job. This type of prostitution is not to be confused with the brothels of the time, rich in furnishings and the ladies well dressed and presented. This was far baser than that. Sailors on shore leave from the many Royal Naval ships, both land-based and in the port, would seek out the company of a lady for the night for a few shillings. More pubs and prostitutes than any other city in England. Due to the largest Royal Naval dockyard in the south, local dignitaries would regularly complain, but the police allowed it to continue. Although Mary plied the oldest trade as it's described, she was a bright woman with a compassionate soul as described by her peers. She was universally liked, and Mary would do anything for anybody. "She's so lovely," was the common reply when asked about her. Mary was originally from Sunderland in the northeast of England, a great distance from Portsmouth, where she had a son and husband. She had moved to Brighton to be with her mother, who was blind. If asked, she always said her husband was dead, but none knew why. Mary had moved to Portsmouth in 1919, perhaps to get away from domestic violence, or simply perhaps it was the sailors. She was known locally as Brighton Mary to all who knew her. On the morning of the 27th of January 1923, a neighbour of Mary's was passing her room when she noticed the blinds were still drawn, but the door was ajar. She called in to inquire if Mary was okay. On not hearing a reply, she pushed open the door to see a lamp was still on even though it was day. She went in a little further and saw the victim Mary on the bed, dressed in just a chemise, her face covered in blood, terribly swollen, and her tongue protruding. In that shocked state, she admitted letting out a scream, saying she had never seen such a sight. She then stated she nearly fell down the stairs in her haste to call the police. She also lived at 13A Blossom Alley, in rooms behind Mary, and had known her for some time. There was yet another lady that lived in 13A, having rooms at the back. When she was asked, she told police she had had a sailor in her rooms the night before and saw him out of the house at about 11 p.m, but not out of the alley. She told the police that she then went to bed and read for a while before blowing out her lamp. She then stated at about 5 a.m, she was awoken by many dogs barking very loudly at both the front and back. Then just as suddenly they went quiet, and she heard no more. She said that she wasn't really friends with Mary as such, but obviously they knew each other to speak to living in the same building. She told police she saw Mary alive at 11 p.m, as she saw her sailor out of the house. She said Mary was also with a sailor, who she said stood a good head above Mary, was very stocky, wearing a big coat and hat. She said Mary seemed excited as the sailor seemed to also come from the north, and she heard Mary say, "Come on, Geordie," a nickname for people from Newcastle. She went on to explain that she saw that Mary appeared to have some bottles of beer in her bag, which surprised her as she knew Mary was short of money. The local police investigation appeared to be stuck, so Scotland Yard were invited to take the case, and there was great positivity in the press at the time that the murderer would soon be apprehended. Inspector Mercer and Sergeant Yardley of the Yard took over the investigation. Next to be interviewed was Lillian Watts, 27 years old, of Surrey Street, an acquaintance of Mary, who said she saw Mary in a cookshop in Queen Street about 10:30 p.m. on that Friday night. Mary had a sailor with her, a tall, dark-haired blue jacket. Lillian was in the company of a man named Page of HMS Ramillies. She left him and then met him again later. He told her he had seen Flossie, a nickname for Mary, and needed to go up to see her. In case you are wondering, the term blue jacket is simply a rating, or sailor with no rank. Lillian went with Page to Mary's address and knocked, but there was no answer. She was asked if there had been a light on, and she said there was. She was asked if there anything else she would like to add. Lillian said that on the Tuesday before the murder, she was with a woman named Tullet and two blue jackets, one named Jock, the other Paddy. Tullet had a mouth organ and gave it to Jock. Both men were naval reservists. On the Wednesday night, both men were seen with Mary. Jock was heard to say to Mary in an argument that he would do her in. The same mouth organ was found in Mary's house, but of course could have been left there on the Wednesday. Although this was an interesting piece of evidence, the police had the problem that all these naval ratings were in and out of port regularly and hard to track down. There was now another new line of inquiry Scotland Yard were keen to pursue, involving a sailor from HMS Ramillies seen with Mary earlier in the evening. However, he was found and could prove he spent the night in the Royal Sailors' Rest in Portsmouth. Then this left one sailor outstanding that had been reported seeing Mary, who also, it was said, was from HMS Ramillies. Of course, it could simply be the case that many witnesses were seeing the same man, but giving different description, so confusing the issue even further. Depending on what reference you read, reports are confused as to who it was made the claim. However, it did end up with the biggest identity parade in the world ever, when 3,500 sailors were stood out for the eyewitness to view. Obviously, with so many, it was impossible for them to make a choice, and no one was charged. Another report states that the witness did pick out a sailor, but the sailor could prove where he was on the night, so was released. Naturally, this could be the report we have already stated. Naturally, as this was such a big news story nationally, people everywhere locally were offering their ideas and offering their own suspects. Without wishing to muddy the waters, it would be remiss of me not to include these, if you are to have all the facts for your own investigation. Are you making notes? It gets even more complicated soon. Next, we find a report in the Portsmouth Evening News on the 30th of January that took the investigation to Horndean, a village about 12 miles north of Portsmouth. The article read, "Horndean has been a centre of excitement in the general hunt for the criminal, and on Saturday evening the local constable was informed of a man who was in the neighbourhood, who acted in a manner that led those that saw him to associate him with the murder." The article went on to explain that the landlady of the Brewer's Arms, a Mrs. Harwood, noted a customer who became agitated after reading the paper, which had been left on the bar by another customer. She noted the pages were about the murder of Mary. He became very agitated, looking this way and that. Another customer asked him why he was so agitated, and he said he had had problems in Charlotte Street, Portsmouth. Mrs. Harwood, the landlady, continued her evidence. "He appeared to be a seafaring man," she said, "but he was wearing civilian clothes which did not appear to fit him properly. His clothes were an ill-fitting dark suit, and his cap was of light texture with a white muffler around his throat. He seemed very anxious to catch a bus to Petersfield, and made inquiries concerning what time the next motor bus left the public house. Shortly after he left that public house, he appeared in the Ship and Bell, where he asked for whiskey, but changed his mind and drank beer. Mr. Bush, the licensee, was immediately struck by the nervous and agitated condition of the man, and also observed the ill-fitting nature of his clothes. He was a fair man of about 30 years of age," said Mr. Bush, "and there were tattoos down to his wrist. I imagined him to be a sailor." In the course of conversation, the stranger said that he was a deserter, and if they, meaning the authorities, wanted to get him, then they would have to find him. The police followed up on these reports and traced the bus driver and spoke to many witnesses in Petersfield, but no one appeared to have seen him. It was unlikely that he had got the bus, and probably made his way from Horndean on foot. Yet another dead end. The case had really captured the imagination of the public nationally, and there was a report in the Dundee Courier of March the 7th of a sailor being held on his ship in Dundee after the Portsmouth police radioed asking for him to be held. Although exciting and very well reported at the time, absolutely nothing came of it. So now our investigation moves on the coroner's court, where the coroner, Mr. Thomas Bramsden, was able to investigate the facts before him. As with all coroners' courts, there was a jury of 12 who could also ask questions. This is an opportunity to see the facts presented in a logical order. In the earlier part of the hearing, it was the evidence you have already seen, as it was just a repeat of what the police had gleaned, and I have reported to you. However, the evidence from the following witness is surely the most interesting of all. The witness's name was Lola Knight, who lived at 11 Blossom Alley behind 13A, and although it was a different house, they were built back to back. She stated there was a crack in the brickwork, and Mary and her could talk together through the crack. Although you could not see through the crack enough to see a person, you could see if there was a light on. They soon became firm friends, she said, and would often lay in bed talking through the crack into the night. She went on to say on the night of the murder, Mary had popped by earlier in the evening, but didn't come in and left straight away as Mr. Fudge was with her. "Who is Mr. Fudge?" the coroner asked. "He is a very old friend of mine," she said. "He got into trouble for you know what." "You'll need to explain what you mean," the coroner said. "It was said by others he was living off my earnings, but it was not true." For a bit of background here, let me explain that prostitution was illegal if the woman went out and solicited for clients. She would be charged with soliciting and receive a small fine at magistrate's court. All part of the business. However, actually having men in her room for sex and being paid was not a crime. Yet any man living with a woman who acted as a prostitute would be charged with living off immoral earnings, a very serious crime at the time, with some serious penalties. "Probably a couple years inside with hard labor," the coroner asked. "What time did Mr. Fudge leave you that night?" "About 7 p.m, Lola replied. "Other witnesses have told us that you had a sailor come to your house. You left him in the house when you went to buy chips. You were gone about half an hour. Is this true?" "Yes." "What happened next?" "I went to bed with him about 11:30, and he left about 5 minutes to 7 in the morning." "What time did you both go to sleep that night?" "About 12:30. "Did you wake up again?" "Yes, about 2 o'clock. I had a drink of water, a touch of rum and a pinch of snuff. I went to sleep again and did not awake until 6:45. "Did you hear any noise from Mary's?" "I heard no noise whatsoever in Mary's home during the whole night. Mr. Fudge came to me in the morning and stayed there until I got up at 11:30 or 12 o'clock. Mr. Bramsden asked, "Did you go to Mary's house at all that night?" "No, I did not," she replied. Now the questioning from an investigator's point of view starts to get really interesting. "Is it true you used to live in Voller Street?" "Yes, sir, I did." "There was a woman murdered there?" "Yes, sir, there was." "Did you live next door to that woman?" "Yes, sir, I did." "Don't you think it very strange you should live next door to two women who are both murdered in almost exactly the same way?" "Yes, I am a victim of circumstance." "Was someone staying with you that night of that murder?" "Yes, sir, a sailor." "Was it the same sailor who was with you the night of Mary's murder?" "No, sir." "Are we to understand that it is simply a coincidence that you lived next door to two women who were both murdered?" "Yes, sir. It's a bit of a shock." In exasperation, Mr. Bramsden finally asked, "Do you know anything more about the murder of Mary Pelham?" "I could not tell you. I know no more. I heard nothing more and I saw nothing," she replied. As you will remember, jurors were allowed to ask questions of the witnesses, and one who was on the same wavelength as me asked, "Was it Mary Pelham who told the police that Mr. Fudge was living off her earnings?" Lola replied, "No, sir, it was not him." Now, before we look at Thomas Fudge, who must surely be heading toward a person of interest at least in our investigation, I suggest we look at the Voller Street murder in some detail, as I feel sure it may be able to help our research. The coroner said it took place 10 years earlier on 8th of November 1913, a year before the Great War. The victim was Jessie Dagwell, who lived at 25 Voller Street, which is close enough to Blossom Alley as not to matter. She was discovered by a neighbour in the morning, lying on her bed dead, almost naked, covered with just a sheet. There were bruises on her throat and a cut on her hand. The information I have managed to glean about the Voller Street murder comes mainly from the coroner's court transcript, and again the coroner was Mr. Thomas Bramsden. Jessie Dagwell's mother-in-law first gave evidence and said that she called at 25 Voller Street at 10:15 p.m. on the night before her body was found, and said that Jessie was very drunk and terribly abusive. Although in some accounts it is claimed there was no love lost between the two women, so it is possible that she could be exaggerating Jessie's temper and drunkenness. Giving the medical evidence, Dr. Lysander Maybury stated that it was impossible to state how long after receiving her injuries, that she died, and that she might have received them hours before she felt the effect of them. As such, it was said that she might have received them some hours earlier, and then later laid down on her bed herself, as she was found and died. To add to the confusion, when Inspector Shepherd took the stand, he said a sailor walked into a Portsmouth police station and claimed he knew who had done the murder. He was interviewed and gave a lengthy statement about how he knew. However, after investigating his story and taking medical advice, it appeared he was not of sound mind and none of it could be true. The manhunt that ensued had all been a waste of police time. He also noted during his evidence they had also followed up a lead after a woman said that she had seen a man leave 25 Voller Street on the morning that Jessie Dagwell's body was found, but said that they were unable to trace that man either. He then went on to state that all sources of information had now been exhausted, and he did not think anything more could be learned. I did find out that Lola had given evidence earlier as a neighbour and had been with Mr. Fudge at the time. The rest of the hearing was taken up with discussion about the totally unsanitary conditions and the fact the street was filled with criminals and prostitutes. There were 2 other murders within a 2-mile radius between 1913 and 1923. The most famous of these was Charlotte Sarah Ann Stallard, 38 years old, of 83 Stone Street, Southsea. She had been married, but had lived separately from her husband for more than 14 years. She lived as a prostitute and had 3 children who she sent to sleep with a friend when she was entertaining men. She was last seen alive in Stone Street at 9:30 p.m. She had taken the children to her friend at 9:20 p.m. on the Sunday and returned to her house. The following morning, her 13-year-old daughter went home to find her mother dead on her bed. She was covered in blood. There was blood up the walls and bloodstains in other parts of the room. The attack had been frenzied. I am sure you will not be surprised that no one was charged and the murder remains unsolved. I have tried to find out if perhaps there was a Mr. Fudge living nearby, but sadly, these slum dwellers were transient, and it is an impossible task. So, as you have seen, no one was charged, or even seriously suspected. Yet we have 4 murders across 10 years all so similar. Surely today the police would take another look. Yes, I understand that prostitutes are always at risk of murder, and it's tempting to say that it's not unusual, and even more tempting to think that perhaps the police felt it wasn't top of their agenda. However, searching the historical archives, these 4 murders were all within a time frame of 1913 to 1923, a 10-year period. None like it before and none similar after. I can't help but feel, like Sir Thomas, there is a link. Are we talking serial killer? A merchant navy fireman, which Fudge was, is like a Royal Navy stoker, so he would have been away at sea returning every so often. We know he was with Lola years before, yet he states he's known her only 12 months. Why? To hide the fact he was with Lola in 1913, maybe. As we know, living off a prostitute has a very severe penalty, and it's quite possible these women threatened to tell the police. Thank you for popping by and listening to my tale of murders most dire. It was surprising that this story of 1 unsolved murder took me to 3 others. It never fails to amaze me where good research can lead. Do you think it was Fudge? Have a lovely day, and do sleep well in your bed tonight. Goodbye, and thank you again for your time.